Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last panel. I hope your energies are still up, because we have a great discussion to be had today with a very timely, very topical subject, Europe's technological diplomacy. We already heard in the previous panel the concept of quantum diplomacy, so I wonder always about even the notion of diplomacy. And I remember hearing someone, and apologies for not actually quoting that someone, that in a way diplomacy is like jazz, you know, it's various experimentations on the same theme. But when it comes to technology, especially to unpack indeed what exactly we understand by technology, science, the digital and various other technological domains, and how we cooperate in this area is quite challenging. I was reading on my train from Brussels to Paris the recent foreword wrote by High Representative and Vice President Borrell, and the line that opens in the foreword is very interesting, especially when it comes to this strategic reflection that the EU is going through the strategic compass. And you know, the line goes along these lines: Europe is in danger. And I wonder how much technology plays into it. So I hope we will get some answers during this panel, because we have quite a bit of ground to cover, from emerging technologies, the technological gap, European gap potentially, technological cooperation, science and technology diplomacy, but also very rich and interesting perspectives from international players and also international institutions from the US, UK, China, Germany, but as well as the European Union. So my name is Raluca Csernatoni. I am a visiting scholar with Carnegie Europe, where I work and lead the work streams on European security and defense, as well as emerging disruptive technologies. And I'm also a guest professor with the Free University of Brussels, and I have the pleasure of chairing this panel. I will go through the list of the presenters in the order that is in the program, and I have the pleasure of introducing to you Dr. Allison Schwier, who is Acting Science and Technology Advisor to the US Secretary of State, and in this role she helps to connect Department of Foreign Policy priorities to research, development and discoveries emerging from academia, as well as the private sector. And we had a bit of insight from the private sector in the previous panels as well on various technological areas. Allison received her PhD in chemical engineering from Columbia University and previously worked for the United States Senate and also at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Clermont-Ferrand. Sorry, I'm not really good with French, my pronunciation. It's dreadful. Allison also studied ocean acidification effect in the Mediterranean region, and her presentation will be zooming in or focusing on opportunities for transatlantic cooperation in emerging technologies. Again, this is a highly timely topic in Europe. Then we will move forward with Ms. Sabina Ciofu, Head of EU Policy at TechUK, where she leads the TechUK international policy and engagement. And Sabina is also leading TechUK's engagement with the European Union institutions, as well as the EU member states. Outside of the EU, her work focuses on other key trade partners, such as the US and Japan. This is also something quite relevant, and maybe Sabina can enlighten us as well with other strategic partnerships, potential strategic partnerships, and not only the US, from the US perspective, and Japan might be also a good example. Sabina also worked previously as a policy advisor in the European Parliament for almost a decade, where she specialized in tech regulation, international trade, and EU-US relations. Her presentation will examine technological cooperation with the UK after Brexit. Then we have Mr. Kaan Sahin, former advisor for technology and international policy with the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Kaan is an international policy advisor with a focus on technology and cyber issues. He was technology fellow at the policy planning unit in Germany's Federal Foreign Office. And prior to that, he was a research fellow for technology and foreign policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations. And during that time, he took a hiatus to serve as strategic advisor for cyber diplomacy during the EU presidency at Germany's Federal Foreign Office. And prior to that, he received a Mercator Fellowship on International Affairs and specialized in strategies to combat hybrid threats, and also was hosted by Carnegie Europe, if I remember correctly, during that time. And last but surely not the least, Professor Stéphanie Balme is research professor at Sciences Po Paris, with the Paris School of International Affairs and Dean of the Collège Universitaire Undergraduate College at Sciences Po. Professor Balme has an impressive CV. She has been a former scientific attaché at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she was also visiting professor at Columbia University Law School, visiting professor and research associate at Tsinghua University, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, not really, in Beijing, and at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and also in terms of research focus, Professor Balme is focusing on science diplomacy, China's science, technology, and innovation policies, AI, and ethics, as well as EU-China relations. During her talk today, Professor Balme will be examining the science diplomacy in EU-China relations. And this is, again, quite a timely topic to be discussed, as well as in terms of future potential trajectories in this relationship. I forgot to mention that Kaan will be focusing on Europe's technological diplomacy, a view from Germany, and he mentioned during the coffee break that he would be interested in also discussing the notion of digital, technological sovereignty, but also sharing some perspectives from working in the Foreign Affairs Office in Germany. Without further ado, I would ask the presenters to go in the order of the program, and we will start with Allison. Just as a reminder, and a bit of logistical details, each speaker is invited to deliver his or her talk in maximum 10 minutes, and then we will hopefully have around 45 minutes for the Q&A. Allison, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to be here to join you in person to discuss transatlantic cooperation and emerging technologies, having traveled for the first time in almost 2 years. So this feels very strange to be in a room with people, not just on Zoom. But thank you also to my Ifri hosts, especially Stéphanie, for extending the kind offer for me to come today. Fundamentally, the United States and Europe have the world's most significant and long-standing scientific and research partnerships. It follows then that the US-EU relationship, being among the largest, most integrated, and interdependent relationships in the world, underpinned by our shared values, including democratic governance, fair competition based on market principles, rule of law, and respect for human rights, makes our futures equally interdependent and highlights the critical need for well-coordinated technological leadership. Given the enormous shared global challenges we face, we will not succeed in advancing our shared values and interests without elevating transatlantic cooperation and coordination, including around emerging technologies, but certainly not limited to them. As democracies, we have faced new challenges, from disinformation to unlawful use of surveillance technology tools, to cyber intrusions, to co-option and misuse, from technologies that we once assumed would favor democratic values. The best way to uphold our shared values and ensure that technological advances are used to lift people up and not to pin them down is to make sure the United States and like-minded countries, such as France and all of our allies and partners in Europe, remain the global hubs of technological innovation through strong networks of countries, companies, and universities. Only then can we shape the global evolution of technology in a manner consistent with our values and maintain our strategic technological advantage and leadership. We can no longer take for granted that our technological advantages are permanent and invincible. Those advantages must be prized, preserved, and renewed. We want the United States and our partners and allies to remain the world's innovative leaders and standard setters, to ensure that human rights and democratic values remain at the center of all the innovation that's to come, and that innovation delivers real benefits to people's lives. We need to close the gaps then and promote consistency and interoperability in our regulatory and legal frameworks so that democracies can collaborate more easily on research and development, as well as on intellectual property protection and export control cooperation. Technology will undoubtedly continue to drive the future of national and economic security and prosperity, and it will transform the future of work and wealth. This is why Secretary of State Blinken, has endeavored to build technology into nearly all of our diplomatic engagements, tech by tech, issue by issue, bilaterally, multilaterally, always looking to assemble the right configurations of allies and partners to get things done. We're proud to partner with our European allies on new initiatives such as the EU-US Tech and Trade Council, the TTC. At the inaugural TTC meeting in Pittsburgh on September 29th, 2 months ago, the United States and EU reaffirmed our commitment to expand and deepen transatlantic trade, technology, and economic relations, and update the rules of the road for the 21st century economy in a way that reflects our shared democratic values, defends against authoritarianism, and delivers for our people. The Pittsburgh TTC statement includes a lot of practical, concrete work on everything from artificial intelligence and semiconductors to export controls and investment screening to non-market distortive practices in trade, as well as dedicated work plans for all 10 TTC working groups. We welcome the opportunity to collaborate with the European Commission in the TTC and in other contexts on governance approaches to technology that advance innovation, take a risk-based approach, reflect our shared democratic values, and address shared global challenges. The OECD and the Global Partnership on AI, GPAI, provide valuable forums for cooperation among like-minded democracies. We're also eager to collaborate on technology issues during Germany's G7 presidency next year. And President Biden has made clear that technology delivering for free societies and for human rights will be high on the agenda for his upcoming Summit for Democracy in several weeks. There are also clear areas where we continue to make critically important complementary strides in shared transatlantic issues that further link us and create opportunities for more cooperation. We welcome Europe's efforts to invest in its technology capabilities as we similarly increase our investments in our own capabilities. The EU, like all of our partners, benefits from protecting against malign influence from those who do not share our same values. The United States and the EU are strengthening the resilience of our economies, including, for example, on critical supply chains such as semiconductors. We share the need to urgently address the immediate supply chain disruptions that the world has been dealing with and stand together to promote innovation and ensure resiliency of supply chains to make sure we have access to all of the products we need, from shoes to furniture to electronics to automobiles, and that we talk about how better to secure ourselves against future shocks. Given our comprehensive transatlantic commercial ties, based on deep and extensive foreign direct investments on both sides, we must ensure our efforts do not undercut one another and create new stress points, both domestically and in the global economy. The Biden administration is working with allies and partners to shore up the integrity of international standards organizations, where the decision on patents and technology development and integration are playing out as we speak, so that it's democracies and stakeholders rather than the coercive or nationalistic efforts of autocracies in these bodies that get traction and drive outcomes. The United States and our European partners also share a commitment to promoting AI that reflects our shared democratic values and respect for human rights. We appreciate that the draft EU AI Act seeks to avoid overregulation of low-risk AI applications. As the legislation progresses through negotiations, it will be important to maintain its risk-based, innovation-friendly approach. This was a topic of interest at the NATO Defense Ministerial and reflected in the recent agreement of a NATO AI strategy, which included principles and responsible use of AI. This past September at a NATO conference in Copenhagen, Undersecretary Bonnie Jenkins, an undersecretary at the Department of State, strongly noted our concerns with the PRC's military civil fusion strategy, or MCF, which is somewhat tied to points that were made in the previous session. Under MCF, the PRC exploits its global relationships to acquire advanced and emerging technologies. It does so through both licit and illicit means, and through trade, investment, joint research and development, and academic collaboration, as well as through IP theft and forced tech transfer. Such efforts threaten the integrity of international research collaboration and joint R&D. and they erode fair global competition, directly hurting companies, institutions, and employees, not just in the United States, but in Europe as well. We all need to work more collectively together to highlight risks from MCF and promote alternative solutions where applicable. Lastly, the June 15th US-EU Summit joint statement included commitments to support and strengthen research collaboration and innovation. The United States has also welcomed recent moves by the EU to remove barriers to cooperation under the Horizon Europe Framework Program. We'll continue to work with the EU and European partners to garner support for such efforts and to advocate for the removal of barriers to cooperation on quantum, space, and other emerging technologies to ensure that we have an open and cooperative transatlantic research cooperation framework. In closing, when the United States and Europe can come together and work on trade and technology issues jointly, we have a tremendous ability to shape the rules, the norms, the standards, and the values that provide the foundation for our increasingly interwoven international science and technology ecosystem that will benefit our respective economic and national security and that of like-minded partners globally. Now, we must take the actions necessary to strengthen that partnership in order to follow through on those abilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Allison, for kicking us off for this discussion. I noted down a couple of keywords: collaboration, shared values, collective work. So maybe we can pick that up later on in the discussion, especially with regard to the TTC. Thank you again, and we move forward with Sabina, who will tell us more about the potential of technological cooperation with the UK after Brexit. And Alice, in her previous remarks in the panel on quantum, already kind of hinted at some of the bottlenecks related to the political agreement between the EU and the UK. So maybe you can talk more about that as well.
Thank you so much, Raluca, and thanks to Alice as well for inviting me to this conference. It's been a delightful conversation so far. I could only be glad to join this conversation at close to 4 p.m. when everyone's tired to talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is Brexit, I'm sure. And when I had to kind of think about what am I going to talk about to you today, about EU-UK relations and how do I frame that, other than it's the best it's ever been, clearly, and it's all going smoothly, as you've surely followed in the news. Actually, it's not, So we are in a very tense political situation. We have kind of the aftermath of the Brexit deal from Christmas Eve last year. It's still making the headlines. It's still a difficult relationship. Things are not running smoothly. We kind of knew that would be the case. Negotiations are ongoing on the Northern Ireland Protocol, as you've surely seen. Fish continues to be an issue, especially for this country and the UK. And there's also been that wonderful AUKUS deal happening earlier this year as well that has thrown another span in the works. So I think we are in a very kind of complicated political situation that's likely to lead to less cooperation on a government-to-government level on all kinds of issues. We are likely to see kind of UK companies locked out of various European programs because there isn't a conversation that's going on between the governments. And I'm afraid that's likely to continue for at least 2-3 more years, I dare to say, because I think until the people and the governments who dealt with the Brexit negotiation are out of the scene, we are unlikely to see a major improvement in that relationship. And for that, we need to wait for the next election, which is quite far away. So that being said, I think given the difficulties in this relationship, the only thing that will keep it going through the next 2-3 years is those common projects and those partnerships at industry-to-industry level, university-to-university level, research institution to research institution, a bit using all our private networks for keeping that conversation going. away from the kind of Brexit headlines that are likely to continue to dominate the news for another while. And, as Raluca said, I represent the UK tech sector in Brussels, as you can imagine, the easiest job on the planet right now. But it is a very interesting challenge because it means we do have more of a voice at industry level and at research level to build partnerships and to build channels of communications when governmental support may not be there. And we need to do that. Obviously, Allison was talking about interdependence. I mean, the UK is just next door, so we kind of need to work together. And building those relationships is not necessarily going to be easy. I think we need to develop a different way of engaging than we used to have. And I think it's really important for the UK organizations on one side to be a lot more humble, a lot more constructive, and to come to the table with ideas on how, what do you have to offer in exchange for that cooperation from the European Union and the European member states and European organizations. So it will have to be a much more constructive conversation. But also on the European side, there needs to be kind of an honest acknowledgement that the UK is the biggest digital economy in Europe. It is the biggest technological market. And that it does something right. Right, it's a research powerhouse. There are things happening in the UK and likely to, we'll see a lot more in the next few years in terms of regulation of technology, in terms of looking at data, in terms of looking at artificial intelligence and others, quantum, as we've heard colleagues speak before about the UK-US quantum partnership. We're likely to see innovations in that space. So I think it's because of that we'll kind of need to keep the conversation going, because it's in no one's interest that we kind of come up with a million different set of rules for the same challenges. So, it's a difficult time. I'd like to think that it will take us just another 2-3 years to kind of maturely deal with each other and work together. But I think ultimately we'll need to get there because we have common interests. We have common interests at multilateral level. We have common interest in all these international organizations. We have common interest in G7, in G20, in other bodies that we will need to kind of get there and work together. In the meantime, it's kind of on all of us to keep those networks going and those common projects running. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation and as well as kind of pointing towards, the advantages of doing low politics versus high politics and focusing rather on networks and communities of research and practice and kind of bypassing the rhetoric and being more pragmatic. And yeah, I would love to hear more as well about how to foster these networks and communications, especially when it comes to, accessing, for instance, some potential EU research funding and some of the barriers and bottlenecks of that and kind of ironing them out. But I now turn to Kaan and I give you the floor.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much, Ifri, and thank you very much, Alice, for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity to participate in a panel with such distinguished experts. We in Germany, we really like the term digital sovereignty, especially since last year, since Germany's EU presidency. When you read the program of Germany's EU presidency, there was the very in a famous sentence, digital sovereignty should be the leitmotif, the guiding theme of Europe's digitalization or quest for digital power. And I think it is very important that, first of all, we understand Europe's quest for digital sovereignty as the capacity to act in the digital and technological realm. And this basically means, of course, that digital sovereignty does not mean digital autarky or digital isolation. And digital isolation is a situation which is very difficult or even impossible to achieve, also for the two so-called superpowers, the USA and China. Furthermore, from a German and European Union perspective, digital isolation is not very much a desirable state, since it would basically mean that we as the European Union and its member states, we would abandon globalization and the global innovation system, and this makes no sense from an economic standpoint, but also from a value-based standpoint. Against this backdrop, capacity to act, or digital sovereignty, cannot only mean that we increase only our tech industries or that we only increase our cyber resilience. It should also mean that we have to build and maintain strategic alliances with state and non-state actors, because we need this. Of course, we are living in a digital connected world, and we live in a world with global value change, especially in the tech sector. And this is very important, of course, from a political, military, and economic perspective. The question is now, of course, how to build and maintain these strategic alliances. And I personally think that the TTC was a very good step in the right direction. Time will tell how effective it will be. Time will tell how this will be evolved. I think there will be still some stumbling blocks, and we will see how the expectations will be met by each other. But I think this is the setup of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council was an important step. Nevertheless, I personally think that the European Union and its member states should stronger focus also on low and middle income countries in the global south. And I think this is something that we are overlooking in the current Europe's digital sovereignty debate. And I think the European Union and its member states, they should develop a more decisive strategy that combines development, connectivity, regional empowerment, but also ethical and democratic tech. I mean, I would say that the European Union should be more outward looking when it comes to the tech and digital debate. And besides supporting these low and middle income countries and getting more broadband and getting more connectivity and getting a more digital skilled population, it should also more trying to promote its democratic and human-centered approach, even though that this human-centered approach is not perfectly defined in detail yet. But for instance, GDPR is a very good example. I mean, we have countries all over the world. We have like South Africa or Japan, which have installed GDPR-like regimes. And I think this is a good example of what the European Union can achieve. And I think that the European Union should engage much more with these countries in Asia and Africa and Latin America, because many of these countries are so-called battleground states. Battleground states, when it comes to the competition between digital democracies and countries which are more leaning to digital authoritarianism. I mean, there's also the term digital deciders, and I think we should focus more on these digital deciders. And actually, I think the European Union has finished an upcoming instruments at hand to deal with the global south when it comes to issues. I mean, not only GDPR, we have also the legislative AI proposal, the 5G toolbox, but also maybe the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, which can serve as blueprints for this European Union approach towards these countries. And given the increasing activity of authoritarian states in this regard, it is crucial that policymakers in the European Union and its member states recognize the importance of these tools as strategic instruments. I know that this is always a little bit controversial, but I think they should recognize the importance of these tools or these proposals as strategic instruments. For instance, we can see an emerging debate when it comes to the cyber capacity building community. Cyber capacity building is also cyber capacity building projects are also very important tools and can be very important tools. But for instance, when it comes to cyber capacity building, we have different so-called parent communities. I mean, we have the foreign policy community, which does cyber capacity building, but also the digital development community, which does cyber capacity building, or also the cybercrime community, which does cyber capacity building. And I personally think, even though that sounds maybe a little bit controversial, we should use tools like cyber capacity building more as strategic instrument, and so to say from a foreign policy perspective, or not only solely based on the digital development perspective. Now I talked a lot about the overall approach, but as Raluca said beforehand, I was working in a German Federal Foreign Office, and I could also gain some insights into the institutional aspects of how to conduct technology diplomacy or digital diplomacy. And we can clearly say that all foreign ministries in the world, they have to actually beef up, strengthen their expertise, their personnel, and their structures when it comes to better conducting tech diplomacy. And I think we have, of course, some front runners in this regard. I mean, take, for instance, Denmark, which has since 2017 a tech ambassador, which has the office of the tech ambassador with offices in Beijing, Copenhagen, Silicon Valley. For instance, Switzerland has recently set up a department within its foreign ministry. And I think this is a way to go for foreign ministries. This is a way to go for foreign ministries to set up dedicated departments and units for, let's say, tech diplomacy or emerging tech, and to have these kind of units besides the already established units or departments for cyber diplomacy. Because many, especially in the European Union context, on the Western world, the foreign ministries, they have already units and departments on cyber diplomacy, but I think we need also units and departments which dealing with emerging tech or tech diplomacy in that sense. And this will enable EU-based foreign ministries to better and effectively conduct tech diplomacy, and as a result to maintain and build better strategic alliances. And this has to be accompanied, of course, by, for instance, other measures such as building expertise among diplomats. For instance, starting to teach about tech diplomacy and emerging tech in an attaché education. And also, the foreign ministry should better use the embassies so that the embassies can better deliver information about tech and digital related developments in these countries. And so the capitals have a better knowledge what are the needs in these countries. And at the end of the day, we can better build strategic alliances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kaan, for a very rich presentation. Again, I marked a few takeaways for maybe the audience, which I found very interesting, this Brussels effect potential and what the EU can do when it comes to setting an example in terms of regulation or new tech regulation. Also courting newcomers and new potential allies, especially rising powers, especially when it comes to, again, new technologies or the digital domain. And also, thank you, Kaan, for being a bit provocative and controversial as well in terms of disrupting the usual, practice of diplomacy by also drawing attention on the fact that Silicon Valley is becoming, in a way, a center of power, and big tech is becoming geopolitical, and we need to take that into account in terms of building, capacity within more the public sector as well, and foreign affairs ministries when it comes to engaging with these new players. But now I move to Professor Balme, and Stéphanie, you have the floor, and I'm very looking forward to hearing more on the science diplomacy between the EU and China relations.
No, thank you, Alice, for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here at Ifri, one of our closest partners from Sciences Po. Actually, I would say that I don't know if diplomacy is jazz, but science diplomacy is definitely free jazz. It's made of experimentation and improvisation, definitely. So when we're talking about EU-China science diplomacy, or basically tech diplomacy, I think it's important to go back to what are the ambitions of China very quickly. How can we assess this ambition today? And what has been the decision of the European Union in terms of cooperation with China? Because I don't think actually since 2019, the European Union has been very clear in what they want to do. So in terms of ambition, I guess I won't go back to what most of people know here. Since 1978, China is very clear about what she wants to become. She wants to rebuild ecosystem, and China projects its power to 2050. was the idea that, you know, in 2030, China wants to be on, you know, ranks of the world's top tier in terms of innovation in very selected areas. And we have the list of these areas. Everything has been written through the Made in China 2025, through the AI, Artificial Intelligence 2017 plan, which has been amended recently, the Internet X Plus, program, the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences programs, and last but not least, the 14th five-year plan in terms of research, science, tech, and innovation. So basically, everything that we want to know in terms of projections for China's powers, we can read it and we know exactly what it means. And the very end of it is that in 2050, China becomes basically the same year that China celebrates its 100th anniversary as a PRC, becomes the most, you know, powerful science tech innovation in the world. So this is discourse. Now, in terms of assessing, you know, China's evolution, we also have figures. We also know what's going on. So I think, because I only have 10 minutes, I might negotiate 15, but at least for the 10 minutes that I'm sure that I have, I can say that based on the Global Innovation Index, we see that China has improved very, very much since 2015. It's now ranked 12 in the world, which is quite amazing. It was ranking 15, 16, 4 years ago. It's just before France now, which is very telling for us. This is one way of looking at it, but if we look at in terms of research and development expenditure, it's much more than Europe and slightly less than the US, but its potential is huge. If we look at the research output and impact in 2019, it's also amazing. China became the world's second largest producer of scientific powers, and I could go on and on. So basically, when we look at the quantitative measure of China's STI, it's amazing. It started to be more of a challenge in terms of qualitative analysis and qualitative assessments of China's STI. For example, papers from the US and Europe, on average, still have the most impact and are more highly cited. And basically, we can say that China is a medium-sized scientific power. It's only a medium-sized scientific power, and when you also look at the 2021 prize, the Nobel Prizes, the one that count for us today, I'm not thinking in terms of literature or the Peace Nobel Prize, but the ones in physics, in chemistry and all, you don't see any Chinese researchers, and you don't even see a researcher who spent either as a visiting professor or as a professor or as a full-time professor sometime in mainland China. So it's quite, we don't see the rise of Asia in the list of the Nobel Prizes of 2021. But that is to say that the potential still of China is huge. And then the question is, because of looking at this potential and this huge ecosystem represented by China, why do we raise this question of should we cooperate with China? It should be normal as a scientist that we cooperate with such a huge potential ecosystem. But of course, this question is important because there is a quite important scientific risk for countries and for companies and for universities to collaborate with China. I would say, at least, as Sabina said, the lack of reciprocity is an issue. Lack of reciprocity, we are definitely not playing under, fair. There is quite an unfair playing field. There's a question of intellectual property rights, for sure. But together with the scientific risk, there are a lot of political risks. And I think the political risks are the one we fear the most currently. I would name just, for example, the problem of techno-nationalism, this idea of the fusion between civil and military sciences that we can't control, interferences by the People's Republic of China in many ways, and the new regulatory framework on data, but not only this one, but also the anti-foreign sanctions law that have been recently voted by the Chinese parliament. And all of this has a direct impact on STI cooperation, that is for sure. So the question is, the problem, the difficulty that the US, Allison said earlier, and we in the EU face is that we cannot not cooperate, and same for Kaan, we cannot not cooperate with China. It's a strong competitor, and still we need to cooperate with China. So how do we cooperate? The question is, shall we, but how do we do that? As for Europe, because this is a topic of my presentation, I think since at least 2018 to 2019, after a very long curve of knowledge, we can say that at the end of the naivety period for the European Union. We can say that we have, at the European Union level now, a real science diplomacy as a strategy on the way. And these can be, I would say, this is, not implemented yet, but at least it can be shown by the 2019 strategic outlook of the European Union, which doesn't deal much about STI, but starts to have a vision on STI. The most important document being the 2020 EU-China Strategic Agenda for Cooperation, and the last but not least, the 2021 reports by the European Commission for Research and Innovation, which is extremely clear, saying, and I quote here, "Collaboration with China in STI is indispensable for both tackling global challenges and also for maintaining the EU's STI competitiveness." So it's very, very clear that in many domains, the European Union wants to cooperate with China, but with a very clear strategy. And in their documents, they basically focus on domains which are all hard science domain. There is nothing related to social sciences, which I feel is a miss, really, in the paper, because we do need to engage China on social sciences. But looking at AI, quantum technology, brain science, robotics, chips, genome editing, of course, biotech, health, deep sea, polar exploration, on all these issues, basically the European Commission for Research and Innovation have decided on three types of cooperation. And they propose three types: collaboration which are recommended, some which are considered as risk, but create opportunities and should have an orange light, as I say, and the red lights are a series of issues where actually because they consider that there are important potential dangers, therefore the European Union should not cooperate with China. So when we look at these three types of collaboration divided by three different colors, the green light, which means we could collaborate and should collaborate with China, there are issues of biotech, issues of food and health security, and everything related to green development and circular economy. And this is very much in line with the COP26 decisions that has been taken. And on all of these issues, the European Union will back definitely, cooperation, which is supposed to be orange, which means we can do it, but it's really potentially dangerous, or there are opportunities, but we should look at it in a very, strategic way. Issues related to artificial intelligence, integrated circuits, brain science, and brain-like research. What is supposed to be the red part, which means really not recommended because they're highly potential dangers, are quantum communications, deep space, and polar exploration, and many other issues, but at least these three ones are very important for us today. So as a conclusion, because I know I'm lacking of time and I don't want to take too much time, one point of conclusion about EU-China and maybe one about EU-US cooperation, and that we can make a good loop with Allison's presentation earlier on. Actually, the academic cooperation is getting difficult and will have very strong long-term effects. And it's getting difficult not so much because the EU doesn't want to work with China, but because the China of Mr. Xi Jinping is closing to the world. And and the COVID pandemic is an added argument, but it's not the origin of the closing down of the Chinese Republic, the People's Republic of China. Second aspect is the difficult aspect for us within the European Union, as Kaan said, is that the EU has great potential in terms of public policy, but also is very divided. And our division, is not to our own advantage, but tends to really be in the advantage of China. And I take the example of Fudan University campus in Budapest that has just been launched this week as a way to reform the local higher education system. And so it's not only that we are divided at the EU level, but within countries themselves, China is dividing us and is playing a role as a game changer. And I'd fully agree with Kaan. We do need a strategy on STI cooperation on third countries, what we call the third countries. You use the term global south, which is very appropriate as well. But basically, because China has a very smart beginning strategy along the Belt and Road Initiative on higher education and science diplomacy itself, we do need, this is one more reason why we also need to involve at the EU level along the Belt and Road, or at least along what we call the third countries. And then the last point is about the question of the EU-US cooperation with regard to China. And that's pretty much, STI is just like for climate change, I would say, is we do need to work together, the EU and US, not to push China, but at least to improve international standards, whether it's the ethical standards or the scientific standards and the legal ones. Much more things to say, but quick presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for, again, a very illuminating presentation and touching upon all the sensitive areas, in a way, when it comes to EU-China relations. And what I noted down, again, is more this maturing of the EU at the strategic level thinking, and also how to engage on science and technology issues as well with China. And in a way, this is kind of in line with a question that we have from the online audience, and this is directed exactly to you, Stéphanie, and maybe I open up the floor to the audience for the Q&A, but we start first with the question from Zoom. The question goes along the lines of how do you think that, or why do you think that Europe underestimated China's status as this rising scientific and technological powerhouse? Is there a specific reason for this, or for this late maturing in terms of strategic thinking? So do you think that Europe has underestimated China's status as a scientific power until a few years ago? And if so, if there is a specific reason or cause for this? Then until you maybe gather your thoughts, we can gather a couple of more questions. I see already a hand here from Alice.
Thank you, Raluca. Thank you, everyone, for a very interesting panel. I have 3 questions at least, but I'll try and be at least quick on those 3 ones. The first question will be to Allison. Thank you so much for traveling all the way. It's very nice to see Americans in person again in Europe. So thank you so much for being here. My question to you is, how do you articulate in the U.S. foreign policy strategy and maybe even the national security strategy as relates to technology and science? What's put forward, for example, in the big AI report, AI and national security report, about maintaining the US's tech advantage, a technological edge, from a US perspective, how do you articulate that with what you suggested should be a coordinated technological leadership, which was how you started your argument, your talk. So I'm just wondering how can you be both one leader and several leaders? Then I have a question to Kaan, also a bit provocative maybe, should we be satisfied with just exporting norms when other powers and countries are exporting technologies? And I guess that relates to the leadership question. And then a question to Sabina, if we're trying to be a little bit hopeful and positive, do you have any success stories of British digital technology companies that since 2016 have managed to indeed have successful projects within the European Union and with European Union partners? Thank you.
I think that maybe we stop here with the questions, and then I will turn to the 2 gentlemen in the audience, and I will ask the speakers to answer. Maybe go in the order of the presentations, if that's fine. Allison, to go first.
Sure. So thank you for the question. I think President Biden and Secretary Blinken and other members of the Cabinet and National Security Council have said the same thing from the beginning. So this is in our interim National Security Strategic Guidance, in the NSCAI report that you mentioned, and in the finalized NSS will be coming out at some point in the coming months. And in all of them, they all focus on maintaining a technological leadership for the US, but doing so with partners and allies. So it's very clear, at least from the US government perspective, that technology is not something we can lead on alone. It's something we have to be working on with our EU partners, with partners all around the world, because many of these global challenges are too great for one country to face alone. And many of these issues are things that we need to work on in concert, whether it's standards or export controls or international research collaboration on things like climate change or pandemics or fusion energy. Whatever you want. So I think there's certainly the realization that any advantage the US has in technology must be matched by shared understanding and efforts with all of our partners and allies to really create that ecosystem that we want to uphold based on the kinds of values that we have built into our technology ecosystem to ensure that that development happens along those democratic principles.
Great. I'm turning over to Sabina.
Thanks a lot, Alice, for that question. So yeah, there's always a positive side to every kind of pessimistic note. So a bit about the kind of UK tech sector and where it exports when it exports. I think an interesting fact, and probably that would be surprising to kind of a lot of you, is that UK small and medium-sized enterprises in tech, but not only, have been exporting less than their counterparts in the European Union, even when we're part of the European Union. So it's a sector that's not necessarily taken advantage of the trade agreements that the EU has reached with a lot of countries and regions around the world, and is generally been not very good at kind of exporting and scaling up abroad. So this is a kind of general problem that, you know, I think commercially but also strategically we've kind of inherited after Brexit as well. Now, when companies do export, they tend to go, and they used to as well before Brexit, to the US and Canada first. So US is kind of the first kind of export market for UK companies. Traditional, strategic, historical links there for why they would do that, but also the kind of opportunity of scale. Common language, you know, common mentality in a lot of places, and is just the easier market to go to. Now, there is, from a government point of view, there is a shift to the Indo-Pacific. We've seen that in the very beginning of the year, in the new foreign policy review of the UK government. There's this new shift, both in terms of trade policy, but also foreign policy priorities of where do we kind of build the next kind of group of relationships, if you want. So we've seen a lot of trade agreements being struck with Australia, with New Zealand, with a new one with Japan. There is a digital economy partnership agreement that's being negotiated now with Singapore. Big focus on digital, big focus on digital trade, and big focus on what they think are the front runners in this space. And they are, you know, historically, you know, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and Chile to a certain extent are the front runners in this space in how they build relationship and allow their kind of tech companies to scale overseas. So I think the broad picture is somewhere else than Europe, and it's likely to increase. I think we're likely to see increased trade between the UK and the APAC region, and increased trade between the UK and the US, even in the absence of a trade agreement that I don't think we're likely to see anytime soon. Maybe Allison can contradict me here. However, that is not to say that the UK tech sector is not a big investor in Europe. It's a story we don't necessarily talk a lot about, but you know, when it comes to AI, autonomous vehicles, a lot of the IoT, a lot of the improvements in kind of energy and mobility, and using tech solutions for that, the UK has been all over the European Union for quite some time. Will it stay? I think so. You know, these are, because of the argument that I was making earlier, these are commercial relationships that have been building over some time. We do have a trade agreement to kind of supplement those relationships happening moving forward. But I think ultimately what we're likely to see is a bit of shift of focus towards the Asia Pacific. That's happening everywhere. It's happening in the US with companies there. It's happening in Europe with our own companies looking at the Asia Pacific region. So I think that will be the major focus. However, we can't ignore that we are neighbors, and it's easier to access a market that's 2 hours away than to go to New Zealand. So it's still likely that we'll see kind of closer ties with the EU.
Thank you. That was slightly more optimistic than expected. I'm turning now to Kaan, and then we will go ahead with Stéphanie.
Okay. Okay, that's fine with you. It's okay. Yeah, I mean, concerning your question, if it's sufficient that the European Union can just export norms and values, of course not. And in a best case, you should combine both. I mean, take, for instance, the case of the African continent. I think 70% of 4G base stations are provided by Huawei. I mean, without ZTE, it's just Huawei. And there is a very interesting World Bank report which says that if you, in 2030, if you want to connect everyone in Africa, like every individual, every government agency, every business, you need 250,000 new 4G base stations. You need 250,000 kilometers of fiber cable. So there's actually a lot of opportunities for Europe to engage more on these issues with, for instance, the African continent. But we have, of course, a disadvantage, or we have two disadvantages. The first disadvantage is Europe is not cutting edge and world class in every technological field. I think this is not surprising. And the second disadvantage that we have, of course, is, for instance, in contrast to China, we cannot co-opt our companies strategically in this sense. Therefore, what we have to do actually is we have to raise more awareness. We have to invest more in private-public partnerships. And I think then we can also offering these countries in low and middle income countries to say, okay, we can help you, but we also put a focus on regional empowerment. I mean, it's not something that we are trying to bring you in a dependence. We are offering you something, but at the end of the day, you should be the owner of these things and you should innovate for yourself. I know that this is a huge challenge, but we have to talk about this because at one point, then Europe will be not credible because they can export so many norms, but if they don't have the power behind it, then it's very difficult to persuade these countries also. Thank you.
That's a great point concerning local ownership as well as engaging third countries based on their pragmatic needs as well, and not necessarily in terms of this export of norms that sometimes we see. Now I'm turning to Stéphanie for her answer, and then we go further with the questions from the audience.
Thank you for the question. I would say that not only Europe has underestimated China's status, but basically the global north, I call it, including, of course, the US, Japan, Korea, and it was a case in Europe at the national level and at the EU level, and for, I believe, many reasons. Among them, first of all, a lack of understanding of China, the idea that it's also, we live under a global north vision of the world. Another idea that China cannot innovate because it's an authoritarian country. Well, actually, precisely, China is saying it's because we are an authoritarian country that we are going to be a scientific power of the world, because the new technologies require a lot of data, require a very top-down legal framework, require a centralized, scientific ecosystems, everything that we have, and requires a very long-term vision. And these democratic systems are very weak precisely because they change every 4, 5, 6 years depending on where you come from. But looking at, for example, the U.S. government situation with Mr. Trump and then post-Trump policy is an example given very frequently by the Chinese government to say that at least they can have a very long-term perspective, as supposedly Mr. Xi Jinping is not about to step down. So I would say all of these also, we forgot that China is reconnecting with its history. China's civilization for some 2 millennia, 2 millénaires, comment on dit ça en anglais? 2 millennials, used to be, if not a scientific, civilization, but at least a civilization of technology and techniques, right? So they are reconnecting with their own historical tradition. And the last point that I would like to add is that researchers understood it very early on, especially experts in China, but at the political level, the moment when countries realized that China was changing and that the center of gravity of the world was moving towards China was after the publication of the Made in China 2025 project, and the reaction of Mr. Trump in particular after this document has been quite crucial. And since then, the other governments really now tend to adapt their policy on the discourse of the Chinese government, and this is very true on artificial intelligence. Most of the plans that have been published around the world have been published after the ones published by the Chinese government on AI.
Thank you for this. It's highly interesting, especially kind of also reflecting on the differences between the science and technology innovation models that we have, and this more dirigiste, top-down, centralized way of doing things versus, this venture capital, Silicon Valley type of approach, and which one is kind of pushing forward when it comes to building powerhouses, because we hear a lot this notion how to become a power, a scientific power or a research power. But what was quite interesting as well, and I know I am abusing a bit my role as a chair here, in a different conversation and again on a panel with China, I also heard this idea that indeed the advancements in science and technology are very fast, and we see that. We see the 2025 plans and the 2050 plans, but one of the experts was kind of pointing out that the EU is now also in a way benefiting from the fact that China is not a diplomatic power. Not necessarily a scientific diplomatic power, but to use and leverage its diplomatic prowess on the international stage. And here I'm relating to this notion that you introduced at the end of China's reconnection with its civilization and the soft normative power that it can have internationally, or the power of attraction. And I find that is also fascinating, or whether this will happen with tech transfers and tech diplomacy or scientific diplomacy. But I stop here because we already have people in the audience waiting. So the gentleman there, and then the other gentleman, and then I think Alice also had a question, and or from the audience,
Thank you. Now I hope I don't end up being told that this is not our topic today, and I know it's always a bit risky to draw conclusions from what speakers do not mention in their speeches. But in terms of the priorities and the themes for engagement, I've heard a lot about cyber, IT, quantum, and I had to wait until the latter part of Professor Balme's remarks to hear the word climate. Now, to the Global South, this is what they care about a lot more than anything cyber. And even the Chinese, the fear of climate change is in them at least as much as it is in us. So please tell me that it's not a different department from technology, that it's integrated with what you do. And I'm wondering if it's not, in talking with the Chinese, a much easier rock to push than AI, for instance.
Yes, thank you very much for very thought-provoking comments. As I mentioned, my name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'm professor of Arctic International Relations at the Arctic University of Norway, and I have a lot of high-level research and teaching cooperation in China and Russia. So these are things that very much concern my daily life. And in these discussions about scientific relations with especially China, we very often hear reference to values, and we very often hear reference to this, how do you say, mixing up of intelligence, military, and academia in China. And I'm curious, I think it's very important to be more specific in these questions. So I did my PhD in Cambridge, I did my first postdoc at Harvard, and I have observed intelligence university connections in those settings. I also, in Arctic research, I noticed the amount of US Navy Office of Naval Research funding for US civilian Arctic research. US strategic Arctic research during the Cold War is very well documented. So the first question is, I mean, how different is the how do you say, merging of intelligence, military, and academia on the Chinese side from Western great powers? And then the other question about values. I have also done a lot of research on the Gulf Cooperation Council states. And Dr. Schwier, I mean, I can't help myself asking you, what's the role of these democratic values you refer to in US science and technology relations with GCC countries? And then finally, a question to Sabina Ciofu. You are optimistic that things will improve when the individuals improve. I basically think the fundamental problem between the United Kingdom and the European Union is that the United Kingdom wants to have its cake and eat it. And of course, the integrity of the single market has to be the core interest of the European Union. So if the United Kingdom continues to think it can have its cake and eat it, how can these relations ever improve? Thank you.
We have two questions from the audience. One is super relevant, especially related to climate, and three questions, I guess, or two as well on, just to sum up, this commercial military complex, I'll call it, or I don't know, education academic complex that we also sometimes see in more Western European-centric context. And then we have another question from the online participants, one online participant, and this is also addressed to Allison. And this is more in relation to maybe if you observe or if there will be some changes between the President Trump's administration to President Biden's administration when it comes to, tech diplomacy towards Europe, especially on issues like 5G, export of strategic technologies to China. So where, for instance, President Biden's administration can use a level of leverage and coercion when it comes to these more hot topics, especially in the context of US and China discussions. So yeah, we'll again go maybe in the order of the panel. Maybe just start with Stéphanie to answer or pick and choose some of the questions from the audience if you want to. If not, we can yeah, to start in the reverse order to be a bit more balanced and not to put Allison on the spot again, to start first and then we go backwards.
And this is because I'm very friendly to the panelists, so they have time to think about their responses. So I think I would like to respond to you. I forgot your name, sorry. Okay. About the first question, which is basically what are the differences between China's scientific ecosystems and our ecosystems? So I do understand the rationale that say that I do understand there is a rationale you make a good point in the fact that ecosystems do share common points. So we cannot say that only in China cybersecurity systems exist. Only in China civil and military fission principles exist in the way we design science. But that being said, we can definitely draw differences in between our systems. And when I say our systems, I'm only taking the EU ones. I'm not putting EU and the US together because I do believe we have a lot of differences and yet common points as well. But I don't know, as you know much more than I do the American system, so therefore I will only look at from the European perspective. So what I would say is the fact that the People's Republic of China is a one-party state with and this one-party state leads to the fact that it's the one-party state that organizes the economic activities, the scientific activities, the military activities of the states. That makes a huge difference because at the very least, it creates a very high level of politicization of the scientific agenda. So scientists are not free to choose what they want to do research on. They have to really meet the targets of a top-down decision, which has been decided at the Central Political Bureau of the Chinese Communist Party. And I would say there are only two areas where really I think people can think out of the box. It's not me who's saying that, but I mean, based on the history of the People's Republic of China, it's a space program and a nuclear program, because it's linked to China's sovereignty. But on many other issues, it's not possible. So which creates, which has positive outputs and negative outputs. In terms of positive outputs is, the different program that China has tends to be implemented. This is a good thing. If the Chinese Communist Party is right in deciding what should be good for China's science, but I tend to believe that scientists know themselves what is good for them. And first of all, whenever you find a lot, for example, if we take the COVID-19 pandemic, the high level of politicization of Chinese researchers prevented a lot of whistleblowers within the Chinese scientist community to explain to the general public and to the media what's happening. So there are a lot of huge drawbacks, and in particular, and the last maybe two other ideas. One is that when you have a top-down politicized research, you tend to produce applied research only, and not to focus on fundamental research. And this is going to be a huge challenge for China. And last but not least, what do we have as a difference? For example, if you take the new law, this, not only drafted but decided in China, that started at this beginning of this month, and which is the equivalent of the GPRD system in China, the GRPD. Ouais, c'est ça? GDPR, sorry, in English, GDPR system. This new law that tend to control data in China has a lot in common with the law in Europe, but without the general rule of law ecosystem that goes together. Meaning that there is no constitutional court, there is no independent court of justice, and so it's going to it might have a huge impact on researchers if they're caught within the different guidings of the law. So, to put it simply, there are common aspects, common points, but there are also true differences, and the key difference is the general political ecosystem.
Great, thank you. I would turn to Kaan, if you can.
Actually, I don't have much to say, since the questions were addressed to my co-panelists, only to the comment concerning climate and tech. I think you just identified an issue where the European Union can strategically engage with these countries, and where it can have also a chance to be a front runner. So this is one of these areas and issues which I would also say that this could be of strategic importance, and here we can have a first mover advantage.
Okay, Sabina.
Thank you. I will go to the Brexit question first, because that's my favorite topic. So don't get me wrong, I fully recognize the bad blood on both sides about this negotiation. I'm leaving it. I'm on the front lines of leaving it in Brussels. I know where it's coming from, and I think it's kind of important to note that both on the EU side and the UK side, probably more on the UK side, the leadership is speaking to a home audience. Everyone is speaking to their own, electorates, if you want. And the headlines are not necessarily helpful in understanding what's going on. Trade agreements are living agreements, especially the modern ones. So we have a trade agreement agreed December last year, realizing their problems with it, and the EU has recognized their problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol implementation that need to be addressed, and there are loads of negotiations going on right now as we speak, trying to find an agreement on what's the best way forward there. So I think generally, when it comes to anything Brexit related, it's probably a lot more helpful to look at what's being done versus what's being said. I would even say ignore what's being said to a certain extent, because it is meant to be likely for someone else. So if you hear Boris Johnson speaking, you know, that is for a purely British audience in a purely domestic context. And a bit the same on our side when it comes to, I think, the Commission talking about Brexit. I think there is a big focus now on the Northern Ireland issue specifically and on the Northern Ireland itself. So I think you'll see a lot more discourse about who cares most for Northern Ireland between the two parties. But ultimately, there is a lot of negotiation going on. There are lots of implementation mechanisms for the agreement where civil servants on both sides at technical level kind of meet regularly. You know, this work is not done. I would like to think it will be done one day, but I'm afraid we'll kind of have to live with that cooperation kind of being a bit of a living exercise where we find issues that we need to address, and then we kind of get back together to do that. So as a broad headline on Brexit, I think just ignore what's being said. On a very important point on climate, and you know, I couldn't agree more, and it's probably something we should put more of a headline on when we talk about anything tech and trade. So what I would say, there is a big focus on climate and tech. We've seen that in COP. We've seen, you know, for the tech sector, it's a huge priority. First of all, because technology does provide some of the solutions, but also as a kind of the footprint of our own sector on the environment. So how do we address that, you know, when you think about data centers and their energy use and where that goes. So I think, you know, huge focus on there. There are some really interesting case studies of companies, tech companies, that are looking at exactly the transparency of supply chains, what's going on, both from an environmental point of view, of like the product's life cycle, but also from a human rights point of view, you know, when we're talking about China, to give companies an overview of their supply chains and what's happening in that. And also from a climate and trade agenda. I think this is something we've seen at the WTO Public Forum as well this year. There is an increased focus on, you know, how do we merge the two agendas together? And I think, you know, clearly there an element of circular economy, an element of electronic waste, and how do we deal with that across borders, but definitely also data flows in terms of the transparency of supply chain and other issues that I mentioned. So there is definitely a merging of various agendas with climate to the core of it. So thanks for raising it.
Thank you, Sabina, for this. And it's an interesting topic, especially the climate tech nexus, because sometimes we hear a lot technology as being the silver bullet and solution to solving a lot of issues, but not to forget that both technology and the climate challenges are more social, technical, and cultural at the same time, and require more of a whole of society approach. But now I'm turning to Allison to answer a couple of questions, and yeah, the floor is yours. And then we will gather after Allison responds a couple of more questions as well.
Yes, I am deeply wondering whether the critical dimension of balance of power is neglected in your discussions on technical scientific cooperation. When we look at the British case with the cancellation of the French-Australian contract, the British took advantage of technological cooperation with the US, but in the meantime, the British will get dependent, like Australia, on this nuclear technology. So clearly this reflects the critical dimension of the balance of power. With regard to cooperation between the European Union and the US, I'm sad not to have understood anything on the critical dimension of the US trying to take control of our technical jewels in Europe, so that we are compelled to build defense policies, selecting strategic investments at EU level and French. So I would like to to hear you on how you deal with these concerns from the European side. Thank you.
Okay, Allison, maybe just to summarize a bit some of the questions for you. I'm again taking more the role of the chair here, and I would be interested to hear more of what you think as well about this, impetus, especially at NATO level, to invest in dual-use technologies with the defense incubator or innovation Diana new initiative, and how that plays out as well in building this capacity in terms of new technologies, but more the dual-use nature of those technologies. But this is more an added on. But again, pick and choose some of the questions and feel free to answer.
Sure, and I will try and be brief because I know we are already at 5 o'clock. For your climate question, yes, it is absolutely integrated into the State Department. It is integrated into what I do. It's my professional background. And we have a special presidential envoy, Secretary Kerry, who's focused on it and was just at COP26. I agree with everything Sabina said in terms of how it intersects with technology, so I won't repeat all of that. But I think you're right. It's something critically important to the technology conversation now, and something that the U.S. is heavily engaged in. For the question about MCF, how is it different from Western powers? Everything Stéphanie said was correct, and I think I would just add that the idea behind MCF is to have greater back and forth on both sides in China in terms of having ideas move from the civilian sector into the military, but also from the military back into the civilian sector. Certainly within the United States, we've had excellent ideas move through an MCF equivalency. That's how GPS was formed. Nuclear energy moved into the civilian sector. One of the main differences between the two is the fact that for many things from the US and other Western countries is that there are things known as end user agreements, where when you're actually exporting technologies in some way, you know who it's going to, you know what it's being used for, and they're the only ones who can have it. In China, and there are well-known cases of this in the public, especially on nuclear energy in particular, there have been civil cases against scientists who've taken that information and passed it to the military. So that barrier between the civil military does not exist in the same way to where in Western countries you have that degree of certainty in where you know the partners you're working with, and that doesn't exist necessarily in MCF. Your question about the role of democratic values in GCC countries in terms of the United States, certainly one of the priorities that President Biden spoke about when he became the president earlier this year is to focus on the importance of human rights in all issues, the importance of protecting people and their human rights, to be very duplicative just then. And I think that does not limit to the countries that we talk to. So certainly when we're engaging with the GCC countries, these issues are coming up. And they'll come up in different contexts than they do with other countries, certainly, as is the case with any bilateral or multilateral conversation. But yes, we absolutely engage on those issues with GCC, just like we talk about women in STEM. And we do that with those countries and other countries around the world. And certainly those conversations can look different, but it is a priority of this administration, and we do not shy away from it when we talk to people. To the question from Zoom, I don't think looking backwards to the previous administration is the primary focus of the Biden-Harris administration. So I think what we can focus on is that the U.S. is really interested in engaging diplomatically, not only with the EU, with the UK, and with all partners. And we're trying to follow that with action. We're engaging multilaterally. We're restarting a number of different dialogues so that we can talk about these issues, talk about our differences, talk about the points of agreement, and figure out how to work together on those things or make progress on those things. That's part of the reason that the TTC was founded, so that we have an avenue to talk about different work streams. There are 10 different working groups on everything from the misuse of technology to artificial intelligence to standards to small, medium business enterprises and how to expand their ability to operate in global markets. So I think in all of those, of course, you'll find different places where the US and EU don't necessarily agree, but having that avenue where we can discuss is critically important. And that is something that the Biden-Harris administration is very focused on. There was the one final question I don't think I totally understood. But in the interest of time, I'm happy to talk to you offline about it so I can turn it back.
We actually still have some time, a couple of more minutes, so if there are some other questions or one very short question, I think Alice kind of indicated her interest, so.
I'm sorry, yes, I have more questions, but you know, we both already have asked questions, so, but I have two quick questions. We have only 3 minutes left, yeah. So you'll see if you want to. But just, I was interested in hearing Sabina's view on the UK's claim for digital sovereignty as well, or technological sovereignty that's made in the integrated review. There is something about trying to be more technologically sovereign, and I was wondering how that is perceived in the private sector, how that ties to international partnerships and trade. And then to Allison again, a question. This time would be about quantum technologies, linking to the previous panel, how you see quantum technology being discussed in global governance or international norms to be defined. Because we've heard recently a lot about AI and how it has to be framed with new norms. And so in which parts of quantum technologies do you see the next debate about international norms to take place?
Okay, if there is a pressing question from the gentleman, but I would kindly ask.
I just want to thank you for the clarifications about this military-civilian fusion, because I think it's very, very important to be very clear about this. And I think the key thing is the rule of law and human rights. I mean, I have managed in my work to publicly upset the chief of Norwegian military intelligence. And of course, I mean, I understand very well the privilege of living in a country where a professor can safely upset the chief of military intelligence. There are so many countries where that would not be safe. But Professor Balme, what you mentioned, I mean, basically, I think it's more China's problem than our problem. These weaknesses to the Chinese science and innovation system. Thank you.
Okay, so we have Sabina, Allison, and maybe Professor Balme would like to react as well. But we will go first with Sabina.
Thank you. Yeah, so that is news because the UK doesn't really do tech sovereignty as a kind of concept or view of the world. We are still kind of very much questioning what I would love if the definition of European digital sovereignty was exactly what Kaan described. That would be perfect. I'm still asking around in Brussels what that means, and I haven't yet got a clear answer to what is the definition of digital sovereignty in Europe. But there is, I mean, other than national security consideration and values considerations, things around human rights in the countries we deal with, UK's vision of the world is very much one of open markets and free trade. It's been that for forever. It is what the government is doing. Very much. We've seen a very busy trade agenda this year, and a huge focus on free trade and opening up opportunities, and walking the talk at home in domestic policy as well. So I don't know what UK tech sovereignty means, such a thing. But of course, there will be national security consideration. We've seen alignment of those national security consideration between what the EU and the UK have said with regards to kind of China and specific technologies. That is likely to continue, that level of alignment, and we do have considerations around values and human rights, but I think ultimately the view of the world is still open markets and free trade, and is something obviously that as a tech sector we very much support.
Yes, to the question on quantum. So I think the one huge difference between quantum and AI is that quantum, as the previous panel spoke about, is so focused on basic research still. There are so many fundamental questions about quantum which are still being addressed, and certainly there are commercial markets that are starting and startups, which is really exciting for it as a technology. In terms of the conversations that are happening multilaterally, right now there's still just a very large push to ensure that research collaboration can happen internationally, and that our top academic researchers can communicate and work together on quantum projects, and that countries are prioritizing it in certain ways. So the US, for instance, has a quantum cooperation agreement with Japan, which came out several years ago, 2019, I think. I think we just had the one with the UK come out, and those are things that are certainly of interest. So we want to make sure that that researchers around the world are able to work on quantum. I do know that there have been conversations about standards discussions on quantum, and I think that's an area that we're really interested in looking at with our European partners to ensure that we're promoting the technologies, protecting digital networks, and ensuring that we can have a thriving innovation system still. And I also know that there have been discussions in the Wassenaar about possibly having export controls on quantum. And I think in that sense, it's still very important to realize that export controls do not apply to basic research, which primarily is a lot of what's happening in the quantum space. So in effect, it wouldn't necessarily impact that amount of research collaboration that we would want to have with the international community.
That's great. And I would finish up with one question to all the speakers, to use one word to characterize Europe's technological diplomacy. And not to put you on the spot, but I'm super curious to hear what exactly that word would be from you. So I don't know, maybe start with Kaan.
I mean, being a German, there will be not one word, so I will just say.
At least it's not a philosophical concept.
It's not it's also not a sentence, but I would say room for improvement.
Okay, great. Maybe I will turn to Stéphanie for one word.
Well, actually, I thought I could answer to this question.
Okay. Yes. Go.
Okay. It's a good way for me to avoid answering your question. So. Two aspects. The first one is on climate and COP26 and green tech. You mentioned how important it is, definitely, and I was worried during the COP26 that no agreement will come out, because I was thinking there's no agreement. How can we are going to put researchers together to? Are we going to put researchers to get together to find a solution in terms of green tech? So this is definitely an important issue. But once we've said that, again, with China is not so easy, because China is one of the top polluter and also the first producer in green tech. And we've seen that through the solar panel, in the evolution of the solar panel market. Now China is producing most of solar panels in the world and has scaled up this market. It's very cheap at a level that it's even not considered as high tech anymore. So it's really good for third countries, but very bad for us who now, because we are also dependent on this green tech in China. So not an easy thing to do. We need to talk about it, but definitely it's difficult. And I can only make a transition with your point by saying that it's because it's difficult that we need a dialogue. So we need, when you say this is China's problem, their political ecosystem, of course, yes, and they're sovereign, the same way that we French are sovereign and the US is sovereign, but it starts to impact us when we do cooperation. That's why, on STI cooperation, what is considered as political risks in China is part of our problem. It doesn't mean that we're going to change it. We might, and surely we have no way to change it, but it's become a problem in terms of research mobility. The anti-foreign sanctions law, for example, is very important. It's also questions about data, the protection of data with a new regulatory framework. So at least we need to address this issue, and we need to dialogue with our Chinese partners. And really, I need to stop? Okay. So I think we're missing a conversation with Chinese colleagues.
Yeah, that's a great point. So Sabina, one word, and then Allison, and we finish.
Regulation.
Okay, great.
I also have a phrase, important for collaboration.
Okay. Thank you very much to all the speakers, and please join me to applaud them for this panel.